What's up, everybody? It's been a while since the last Extremely Strange, but I'm going to try to make up for that tonight, as this story is going to be a bit longer than the usual that I post here. And that's because it's the true account of a haunted house with so many twists and turns that it inspired a book titled Gravesend, written by the woman who experienced it all. And I highly recommend it too. At its heart, it's also the story of a typical blue-collar family who moved into the house of their dreams, only to watch their happiness unravel as a wide range of paranormal activity held them within its grasp. So don't leave any stone unturned in your own house, because you might find its hidden secrets to be extremely strange. Fall of 1982. And Elaine Fazio and her husband have been looking for a home suitable for their family, which includes their two small daughters, Karen, aged 11, and Christine, 5. Tired of living in their small Brooklyn apartment huddled around portable heaters for warmth, they saved up a small amount of money for a down payment, but most properties they were shown landed well outside their means. Among the listings they saw was a house right there in Brooklyn that had been on the market for 2 years. Their real estate broker, while assuring them it was well within their price range, claimed it needed far too much work and likely wouldn't be a sound investment. Undaunted, they asked to see the home and took the short trip to view it. As they entered the unkept yard and took their first look at the rather dingy old house, they were greeted at the door by a middle-aged couple who seemed pleasant enough and immediately took them up to the second floor. The Fazios, always primed for another letdown, nonetheless had high hopes they might have found their permanent home. But beginning on this day, their lives and those of their daughters would be forever altered by a series of bizarre events to follow that would challenge their sense of security and wreak havoc upon their lives. The second floor seemed to run the gamut between airy and spacious to small and dank. Obviously, the entire house was overdue for a facelift. One of the sticking points was the presence of the couple's uncle and aunt who lived on the first floor, steadfastly refusing to give up the home they had lived in for 40 years. They had sold it to the couple years before and were paying nominal rent to remain there. The words spoken by the wife brought the Fazios back to reality when she revealed the couple were a tough nut to crack, particularly the cantankerous uncle who was doing everything in his power to drive away prospective buyers. She and her husband were eager to move to Florida and wished the Fazios luck in convincing the couple to move out. It was clear they were tired of dealing with the old man and placing full responsibility on Elaine and her husband to work it all out. Surprisingly, a month later, the agent called to say the couple had lowered the price even further, and the elderly couple had pledged to move within a reasonable amount of time. Hopes were lifted, and by the winter of 1982, the house belonged to the Fazios. But because of the old couple's reluctance or inability to move, 18 months would pass before they found an apartment and finally left the house. While the moving was in progress, they met some of their new neighbors who shed light on why the house didn't have a full basement. They learned it was actually transported there by trailer from a nearby location sometime in the 1940s. In the basement were two small doors, about 4 feet off the floor, that could be opened, which led to the unfinished part of the basement, which was essentially nothing more than a crawl space. It was called the dirt room. The first hint of potential issues came from Elaine's brother, Joe Bevilacqua, who was helping them move in. Joe felt something very unnerving about the basement, but kept this reaction to himself so as not to dampen everyone's excitement. The mood began to alter when Elaine would make trips down to the basement to do laundry, where she was overwhelmed by a strong sense that she was not alone when clearly no one else was down there. Being the pragmatic sort, she put her feelings aside and focused on being a happy homeowner with her own washer and dryer. But happiness wasn't an all-encompassing emotion, as her marriage was going through a period of turmoil, which had actually started years earlier when the couple was first married. Elaine felt that perhaps a new home would result in a renewed start, but the arguments between the couple were continuous. The girls were given a small back bedroom complete with bunk beds. Eventually, the plan was to move Karen, the older of the two, into her own room, which would be in the basement. Meanwhile, the sensation of being watched became much more pronounced in Elaine, resulting in an ever-present tingling sensation at the top of her back when those feelings would occur. She eventually went to her husband to ask if he had ever felt anything out of the ordinary in his upstairs office. A bit confused, he said no, but asked Elaine to explain what she meant. And as she did, he quickly denounced her assertions, brusquely telling her to get a grip on herself. As the relationship further deteriorated, she opted not to mention anything further of this to him again. It was becoming clear that their marriage was dissolving in their new surroundings. Elaine decided to take classes aimed toward her ambition of becoming a nurse, and was doing quite well, something that further drove a wedge between she and her husband. Thankfully, her determination to succeed focused more of her attention on classwork than the issues of their failing relationship, as well as the continued feelings of being observed by something unseen. Within a year, Elaine's odd sensations elevated to the point where she became fearful of being alone in the house. Meanwhile, Karen would tell her mother of strange noises that appeared to emanate from the clothes hamper in the bathroom. She described them as clawing or scratching sounds. A search uncovered no sign of rodents being responsible for it. One night, Karen was lying on the sofa when she saw Christine go into their bedroom. She followed her and walked into the room, only to see no sign of her sister inside. She went to her mother, concerned about where Christine had gone. When Elaine called out to her, Christine answered from the bathroom, assuring them she hadn't been in their room all night. On another occasion, Karen was sitting on her bunk bed having a conversation with Christine, who was standing on the chair next to it. That is, until Christine actually walked into the room. Elaine became concerned with Karen's mental health and the possible stress of her parents going through a rough time. Her school counselor said she was well-liked and her grades were good, which only added to the uncertainty of what was happening to her at home. A year later, Karen had turned 13, and the time came to prepare the basement for her new living space. Cleaning out the clutter was a daunting task, to say the least. There were items discovered from years past, but nothing worth any real value except for its whimsical quality. While the basement room was being built, the feeling of being watched became even more intense for Elaine. When sharing this with Karen, she was moderately surprised when her daughter shared that she had the same sensations. Over dinner, even 7-year-old Christine claimed to be experiencing something similar, but all of their assertions were dismissed by Elaine's husband, who refused to entertain any of it. Soon Karen and friends she invited over would venture inside the 2 doors leading to the dirt room without Elaine's knowledge. During this time, the heaviness in the home increased substantially, as did that all-intrusive feeling of being watched. Things took a darker turn when disembodied footsteps began to echo through the house. Elaine would hear them going down the stairs to the basement, heavy and purposeful. She did her best to ignore them on the random instances when they would occur. Meanwhile, the girls continued their exploration of the dirt room, once returning with an old-style lantern. The smell on it from the crawl space was dank and musty, and Elaine made it clear they were not to venture inside anymore, partly for their own safety, but also because of the negative feel to the area. One night, Elaine thought she heard Christine calling to her, and when she responded, Christine told her she thought Elaine was calling her. Then they both heard Christine's name being called again, accompanied by what sounded like maniacal and almost mocking laughter. Karen, now in her new basement room, began to withdraw a bit more, and Elaine found her reciting the rosary one day while sitting on her bed. When asked why, she responded it seemed to help her through the dreams she was having lately regarding a door with the writing, "I bestow upon you these certain gifts." It was at this time that Elaine began to experience her own disturbing dreams, where she would feel paralyzed in her bed, with a heavy suffocating pressure bearing down on her, pressing her further into the bed as she actually saw the indentation in the mattress. Sleep paralysis was always in the back of her mind, but this was a different sensation that would occur 3 to 4 times a week, and then not for months at a time afterwards. After one particularly horrific night, Elaine brought up her issues at the breakfast table, and was surprised when Karen said she had been experiencing the same thing, but she wasn't reacting as emotionally as her mother was. Her husband, on the other hand, was nonplussed by their experiences, and it was typically the case, simply ignored them. Elaine discovered that Karen began having her dreams around the same time the footsteps on the basement stairs started, and couldn't help but think there was somehow a connection to those doors into the dirt room. Then one morning, Elaine heard Karen screaming from her room, and rushed down to find her bedspread had been pulled off her and arranged on the floor in a perfect square. This was followed by she and Christine, who had joined her at that point, watching Karen's blanket and then sheet being pulled off and settled in the same manner. Despite her vehement protests, Elaine insisted that Karen now sleep upstairs on the couch, but she would often sneak back down to her room when everyone went to bed. Elaine was doing her level best not to give in to the concept that the house was, in fact, haunted, but that would be a short-term denial. Her brother Joe seemed to be the only one she could confide in, and he shared her concern, based on his own feelings on moving day, that the issue didn't lie with her, but the house itself. Elaine visited a therapist who had helped her with some personal issues years prior, and upon hearing her story, didn't dismiss her, but instead suggested she take some time to read up on the paranormal and learn more about it, rather than place any blame or responsibility upon herself. At the age of 38, Elaine eventually graduated from nursing school and went to work in an ER at a local hospital. She was able to switch to the 11 p.m. to 8 a.m. shift, in part to get away from the recurring night terrors she had been experiencing at home. The change seemed to do her some good, as they were less prevalent while she slept during the day. But the activity in the house continued to become more disturbing. One night, the family again rushed to the basement in response to Karen's screams. There, Karen claimed she awoke to a gerbil cage she had in the room floating over her head that suddenly dropped on her. She actually bore the mark on her face where it had struck her. Another time, Karen reported feeling something jumping up and down on her bed, actually depressing the springs in the mattress, yet saw no figure responsible for it. She also continued suffering through the same dreams of suffocation as her mother, often multiple times a week. Foul odors began to permeate the dining room they could not attribute anything to, and then one day Karen reported seeing what she described as a 7-foot formless mist hovering near her door almost nightly. Elaine was in the basement doing laundry one day when she actually saw the form herself as it floated past the open bedroom door. One morning, when they were alone in the house, a loud banging from the attic awoke Elaine and the girls. It sounded like someone was stomping their feet as they walked from the rear to the front of the house. When she called her husband home from work to investigate, he found nothing, but as he was leaving, he too heard the banging. Despite this, he lent it no credibility, and ignoring his family's obvious alarm, simply returned to work. It wasn't long after this that the couple divorced, which seemed for a while to have a calming effect on the house. It was thought that perhaps the negative dynamic between them was in some way feeding whatever was present with them. In time, Elaine began seeing a man named Matthew Mercado, who was the antithesis of her husband in many ways, and a relationship developed. Karen had decided to move into the attic, and while being helped do so by Christine, they discovered a small storage area. Upon investigating, they found a box that had been taped shut and opened it to discover a tiny wedding dress wrapped in newspaper dated from 1952. They excitedly brought their discovery down to Elaine, whose reaction was to immediately discard it in the trash, as it seemed too strange a find in too strange a place to have anything but a negative implication. Around a year later, the girls were all in the house one night when they heard Christine's name being called, just as they had some years earlier. Elaine described the house at that point appearing to come alive. So worried, she phoned Matthew to ask him to come over, and though it was a bit late in the evening, he agreed to do so. It was then that Elaine told him the entire story of what had taken place in the house all these past years. His reaction was unfamiliar to her, as he actually believed her, going so far as to spend the night downstairs while the girls went off to bed. Drifting off to sleep while watching television, Matthew had a disturbingly vivid dream in which he was attempting to open a door while struggling against a powerful force that held him back. When he finally opened the door, he saw a skeletal-looking man lying on a dirt floor and immediately snapped awake. It seemed at this point the house had now affected him as well. And then one night, Christine heard an odd noise and walked out of her room to the stairs, where she saw her mother sitting down on one. When she called out to her, Elaine didn't respond. Frightened, Christine ran downstairs and encountered the actual Elaine and told her of what she had just seen. Apparently, the apparition had simply vanished. Halloween saw Elaine throw a costume party, which was attended by a co-worker, who at one point Elaine saw walk out of the living room, perhaps to use the restroom. When Elaine walked to the kitchen, she instead saw her friend staring down at the basement stairs. When Elaine went over to check on her, the friend asked about the little lady and told Elaine she felt her house was haunted. Apparently, she had sensed the woman to whom the wedding dress belonged to. Later that night, sleeping in the same bed, Christine looked over as a misty figure hovered over her sister Karen as she slept. Paralyzed with fear, she rolled over and tried to ignore what was happening, closing her eyes to the terrifying scene playing out. Meanwhile, in her room, Elaine was experiencing another of her suffocation incidents, but this time she was certain the energy pushing down on her was that of an angry female. Then one morning, while taking the trash out, Elaine ran into a neighbor who'd lived there quite some time and asked if anything strange ever happened in the house. He claimed he used to babysit the children of a couple who lived there. The son grew up and married, but he and his bride lived upstairs in the attic while they got settled. One night, the wife, who the neighbor described as a tiny little thing, fell and struck her head. With the injury being so severe, she died right there in the house. He remembered them taking wedding photos on the outside stairs, and her wearing a small white wedding gown. At that point, everything that had occurred in the house began to make sense, and that realization struck Elaine hard, as the reasons for why it was happening all fell into place. In February of 1995, Elaine reached out to famed paranormal investigator and parapsychologist Hans Holzer, who paid the family a visit, accompanied by spirit medium Marissa Anderson, with whom he had shared no details of the case, including its location. She was picked up and driven to the house, essentially going in blind. As she walked in, she saw Elaine and immediately knew a long-time struggle was taking place. She assured her she would get her house back for her. Though very humid outside, the house felt dark and cold. As they moved toward the living room, Anderson became certain they had the full attention of whoever or whatever was there. In a hallway, she felt certain there existed some form of vortex, and instinctively knew it originated from the basement. But first they went upstairs, where Anderson sensed the house was not at its original location. and where she saw visions of a white dress and someone in mourning, as well as something placed behind a wall. She was only then told about the white dress being found behind the wall, the relocation of the house, and the fact that someone had indeed passed away there. Inside the basement, Marissa immediately made her way to the doors that led to the dirt room, hoisted herself up on a table, and crawled inside. After a while, she came back and sat in the opening, and was able to see under the dirt where a male spirit in a different language told her he was okay now, but along with two fellow co-workers were buried in a cave-in, possibly in a subway tunnel collapse. While she went about her work, Holzer and the rest of Elaine's family earnestly looked on in rapt silence. Eventually, Marissa convinced the three spirits to seek a doorway and move toward a light that would present itself there. She claimed the crossing over didn't take very long to achieve, and after this was done, the home immediately felt lighter and airier, and no further issues would plague Elaine, her daughters, or Matt. Sadly, in 2017, Elaine Mikado passed away after a lengthy battle with cancer, but to the end she lived her best life as she traveled, became a community advocate, and put everything that happened at her former home in the past. We learned that older or even newer homes can indeed hold secrets, and one never knows under what circumstances they might reveal themselves. Renovations, dark entanglements, or perhaps even broken family dynamics can be their trigger. In any event, we also learn that seeking help is not a sign of weakness, but actually signals strength and realizing that sometimes we can't go it alone. In the case of Elaine Mikado, exposing those secrets not only helped her and her family, but aided the spirits who held on to them go on to a better place by recognizing and ultimately alleviating their pain.